Hello viewers, this is the Model Guy, and we're going to start 2020 off with a series of videos featuring the Airfix 124 Hawker Typhoon. This kit is so large and so involved that there's no way I can justifiably do a single video to cover the entire build. I would have to cut out too much footage and it would take away, I think, from the overall impression of this kit. Airfix has ventured into the 124 scale in the past with their Hawker Hurricane and their Spitfire, and then the Typhoon in 2014. The car door version was released in 2016, and I was interested to see how this kit goes together before looking at the new Hellcat they've released. I've heard some mixed reviews about the Hellcat, and I believe it's best to be honest, and I'm going to be very direct with this kit. The first big negative thing I have to say about this kit is the amount of cleanup that has to be done on the parts. There's mold lines on everything, and there's ejector pin marks as well that have to be filled, and they're in some horrible areas that are going to show if they're not tidied up. The framework of the cockpit actually goes together quite well, but one issue is that main wing spar that I'm fiddling with here can easily go backwards, so you have to double check that you're putting that in the right way. If you've put it in backwards, you've pretty much shot yourself in the foot and you're going to run into issues downstream. I'm adding some lead wire to the firewall here of the cockpit just to bring some more life to get away from the molded on wiring because I didn't find it very accurate and I felt that this was worth the effort for a better look. One thing I quickly learned with a 124 kit is that you can't cut corners because everything is going to be visible. Airfix gives you three options in this kit for displaying the engine. You can either have it fully visible with no panels, you can have the top cowling, or you can have the top cowling and bottom cowling in place. One common complaint, though, that I've read online and that my friend at work has had with his Typhoon is that if you put the engine in as a full build, it's almost impossible to get those cowlings down properly on the aircraft. As a heavy equipment technician, I love seeing the mechanical workings of machinery. And before I even opened the instruction booklet to page 3, I knew I wanted to have the cowlings off the aircraft and everything visible. Like a lot of things in modeling, that started me down the rabbit hole because if I could take the engine cowlings off, I wanted to know what else I could show from the aircraft that people normally wouldn't see. This aircraft features a full cockpit and wing gun base, so there's a lot to start with. Here I've stolen an idea from Night Shift, who does some phenomenal armor builds. If you haven't seen him on YouTube, definitely check out his videos. And what I'm doing is just using some epoxy putting that's been rolled into tubes. I'm using a small tool made with a pop can to put actual weld beads on the engine mounts of this aircraft. Having done that, I've set a bar for myself with this build, and it was time to do a lot more research to what I wanted to do. Checking online and finding photos of the Typhoon was great for reference, but one of the things I found online that really inspired me was a workbench blog done by David Gasper from Airfix, who had built a 124 teardrop Typhoon as a cutaway in a museum diorama. Now armed with all my photos and references from Kelowna Flightcraft's Tempest that they're restoring in British Columbia, I knew that I wanted to build my Typhoon to look like it was under restoration in a hangar. It's sort of a tribute to all the restoration crews out there keeping these aircraft flying. One of the challenges I found with this kit was it's the first time that I've had to pre-paint a lot of the kit while assembling it. Usually I like to assemble as much as I can, like the entire cockpit, for example, and then paint all the details once they're in place. However, with this kit, you're going to find there's a lot of things that once you install them, you're not going to be able to get at it with a paintbrush, so you have to paint it beforehand. I couldn't paint the firewall beforehand because there's some gaps where the tube frame runs through, and those had to be filled and sanded prior to painting. So that was a little bit of a setback as I had to tape off everything before painting. But one of the cheats I came up with was to put acrylic paint down on top of the lacquer and I could wipe it off with a Q-tip afterwards. Just in case you can't see the Q-tip in the frame, there is my 5-year-old pointing to it right there, the model kid. So there you go. Onto the seat now. Airfix gives you two options with this. You can either install the pilot, who has his harnesses and everything in place, or you can install the seats and put in the kit seat belts. I found those were too thick and out of scale, so I decided to order in the HGW fabric belts. I've just been getting into miniature painting, so one of the things I'm trying to do here is bring in some shading and some depth to that seat back, just to give it a little more color. I found the cockpit was going together well for this kit. The only issues I'd run into initially were the mold lines and the flash that had to be removed, but a big setback was when I went to install some of the smaller pieces in the cockpit and started finding that a lot of the hoses and piping weren't reaching the items or areas they're supposed to be going to. For example, the hydraulic pump to the left of the pilot, the hydraulic line underneath there didn't reach. It was almost 2 millimeters short. So I had to scratch weld that with some lead wire to make up for it. While I'm doing some very minor weathering here on the model, we'll talk about the Typhoon a little bit. And one of the big things was that this aircraft almost never made it into frontline service. Production was plagued with problems, and a lot of those actually made it through to frontline service with the aircraft. Two very serious issues were, one, the firewall wasn't fully sealed from the engine bay, so when the pilots started up the aircraft, they were immediately getting doused with fumes from the cockpit, and a lot of them were getting rendered unconscious before taking off or during flight. This issue was never resolved in the Typhoon's production, and pilots had to be on oxygen for the entire time the aircraft was running. Another serious problem with the Typhoon was that under any high G maneuvering or stress on the airframe, the tail would tear completely from the aircraft. Ground crews made the effort to reinforce the tail by adding fish plates, and this worked out well enough that it went into production with later Typhoons on the actual assembly lines. Even with these modifications, the Typhoon, or the TIFI as it was nicknamed, was still a dangerous aircraft to fly, and many pilots were killed by structural failures in the aircraft instead of enemy ground fire. The main reason that the Typhoon got pressed into service, even with all of its defects, was the fact that the RAF was having trouble catching the Focke-Wulf 190. The 190 was outclassing the Spitfire Mark V at the time, and it would come in fast, low-level hit-and-run attacks on the RAF before going back to France, and the Mark V Spitfires weren't able to catch them. The irony is that the Typhoon was originally set up as a high-altitude interceptor, but it was failing at that role with a lack of performance. But at a low altitude, it was more than able to catch up to the 190s, and it was quite the surprise for the German pilots when these came into service. Once the Mark IX Spitfires came into service with the Royal Air Force, the Typhoon was relegated to a ground attack role, but with its 20mm cannons and rockets and bombs, it was more than a devastating aircraft against German armor. The Typhoon, and later the Tempest that was developed from it, were so effective and demoralizing as ground attack aircraft that if pilots were unlucky enough to be shot down in an area where they were operating, Typhoon pilots and Tempest pilots would regularly be executed by German soldiers. Now, in the last few minutes of the video, you've seen me adding some highlights to the aircraft cockpit, which I normally don't do in my build, so I'm not a fan of forcing lighting, but I thought I would try it in this case, because I want to build this aircraft like it's being restored, so a lot of this cockpit is going to be open to lighting. Another thing that's going to be a challenge is the fact that it's so open, the way I'm building this, is that the rear of the cockpit panel may be visible. So I decided to use some TAMIYA epoxy to build the back of the gauges and run some soldering wire from it just to add a little more character to the aircraft cockpit. The instrument panel is nicely detailed, but Airfix only gives you about 10 decals for the panel itself. And in this scale, 10 decals is not going to be enough because so much of that panel is visible that it just screams for more detail. So what I did was go online and found that AirScale had released a kit that had 50 plus decals in it just for the instrument panel alone, and it was a must-have. So the smallest decal for that kit was about 1 millimeter wide by 3 millimeters tall, and that decal itself was for oxygen pressure in the aircraft. That's the level that AirScale went to, and it's a must-have for this kit if you're building it. This kit was the first time I've used TAMIYA epoxy putty, and I absolutely love it. I've used Milliput in the past to fill some holes and stuff like that, but the problem is it wasn't drying hard enough for me, so maybe my mix ratios are off or something like that. But this stuff dries completely hard, and you can sand it, and it's fantastic to work with. Even just putting some water on your finger, you can sculpt it while it's drying. Now we're finally getting the chance to see those AirScale decals, and what I've done beforehand is just put some micro set in place, followed by some micro sol once that decal's on. Then once everything's had a chance to dry, I'll come in with some clear gloss from TAMIYA and just put a few drops on the gauge to get that nice 3D glass effect. You can see the detail that AirScale went to with that center bank indicator dial because that's how it sits when the power is off to the aircraft. Plus everything's printed so finely, there's a lot of detail here. One thing I'm not understanding that Airfix did here, and TAMIYA did it on their 132 Corsair, is they give you the gauge glass as a separate clear piece, but the problem is you can't put your decals on top of it. So do they want you to put your decals behind it to get that gauge effect for the glass? I'm not sure. If you understand, put a comment in the comment section because I really have no idea why. So this is the method I used. With the cockpit drying, it was now time to move on to my second aftermarket investment for this kit, and that was HGW seatbelts. If you've never seen these before, you're missing out. Basically, they are fabric strips built like a real seatbelt with the buckles separate, and you actually have to thread them yourselves. Once they're together, the look of them cannot be beat. Airfix gives you a seatbelt for this kit, but it's a plastic part, and they're too thick for the scale. Or you can use the pilot. I decided to go this route, and once everything was assembled and glued down, there was no way that anything plastic could have come close to the same look. These are fiddly to put together, so plan on spending some time and some patience to get everything assembled. I've left this clip just so you can see the effort that's needed to thread this through the buckle. I'll definitely use these again in 1/48 scale, because the nice thing about the fabric is you can bend it and set it any way you want it to look, and you don't have to worry about paint flaking off like it does with photo etch belts. Once the seatbelts were assembled, I just glued them at the top. That way they would naturally fall where they wanted to go, and I wouldn't have to force them into a weird position that didn't look right. With the cockpit assembled, it's now time to move on to building the engine. One of the coolest things I find about the Hawker Typhoon is the fact they took an H-block engine and made it operational and made it work in the airframe. It's a very powerful engine, but it's very complicated and has a lot of drawbacks, the biggest one being it's very difficult to work on. The Sabre engines did produce a lot of power, but this was at the same time that jets were starting to come into service, and they quickly were outpaced. Once again, you can see here that the mold lines are coming into play with this kit, and even though they're not too difficult to remove, it does lend for a longer build. This is one of the first major fit issues with this engine, is that with the pin in place to locate the rear structure, it pushes it away from the block and you end up with a 1mm gap. I had to remove that locating pin just to have those things sit properly. Painting this engine was a little bit of artistic license. I was online looking at what the engines looked like in museums, and they're generally this Napier green. And then I found some pictures of a Sabre engine that the Smithsonian had, and there was some interesting yellow chipping underneath the black paint. So rather than just do a boring black engine, I decided to paint this the Napier green and then do some chipping on top of it. I know chipping is all the raz right now, and everybody has their different ways of doing it. I use this a couple different ways, but this one, basically, you're going to take a clear coat to protect your color that you want to show through, and then you're going to put Vallejo chipping fluid on top of the clear coat, and once that's dry, you're going to apply your second color that you're going to want to chip away. I decided to use NATO black as my main color. That way when I was painting my hoses black or rubber, it offered a lot more contrast than what a flat black engine would. Once that NATO black layer was dry, I'm going to put some water on a stiff brush here, and I'm going to start chipping away the paint. And I'm going to do this in areas that would have a lot of traffic on it, like your front engine cover, your valve covers, things like that. Anything that's going to have a crew climbing on it or banging on it or dropping wrenches. Once I was happy with the chipping, then I just came in and did some dry brushing with some Mr. Metal Color aluminum. This just helps bring out some of those smaller details that may not be fully visible if they were left black. One thing that was difficult for me when assembling the engine for this kit is the fact that I'm used to painting everything once it's assembled, and you can't do that with the engine because a lot of these pieces, once you've installed them, especially hoses, you can't reach them at the back of the engine, and you basically have to paint them before you put them in place after some test fitting, and you'll later find out downstream that another piece goes next to it, and then you have a seam that has to be cleaned up and then touched up, so it's a lot of challenging work to do that. Cleaning up mold lines got old pretty quick on these hoses for the engine, so I actually found it easier to take some lead wire and to actually come in and remake the hose out of that wire. That way I could bend it if I needed to fit into place, and that there was no mold line to clean off. So it was actually less work to do this than clean the lines. Airfix had updated their instructions to get this fuel line in place, but because I was using lead wire, I could actually bend it and get it into place before securing it. So it turned out to help me out rather than using the plastic piece that would have broke. Fit issues continued with the engine build as a lot of hoses either didn't sit properly in place and had to be modified, or they weren't long enough to reach the areas they were going to. And for major lines on the kit, there was a lot of work to get those to fit properly, or else nothing else would fit around them. This was only the tip of the iceberg, as there's a lot more components that still had to be installed on top of the engine, behind the engine, and underneath the engine with the framework in place as well. I wanted the engine to have a lot of wear on it because I wanted it to look like it had been temporarily installed to be mocked up and fitted before being removed for paint. One of the simplest methods for putting chips on a model is to just use a sponge dipped in some paint and then randomly placing it around. I'm using this in the high traffic areas just to add some more depth to the paint. I had mentioned earlier that I was doing a lot of pre-painting before installing a part, and a lot of test fitting had to happen here before this was installed, as it has to tuck under another piece and it has to reach another side of the engine block. And the best part about all that pre-fitting and pre-painting, it doesn't fit the ignition wires on the other side of the aircraft. Here I've painted this as zinc chromate green just to stand out a little bit and add a point of interest to the engine. Maybe this part here is new old stock and was simply cleaned up before being delivered to the restoration team. Cleanup on this piece sucked because the mold line ran right across the flex pipe and I had to get into all those tiny grooves, and I had to clean up all these segments as well. To make matters worse, the bottom half of this mold didn't line up 100% with the top part of the mold, so I had to rebuild all of those connections as well. On hindsight, I should have just taken the time to build this all from scratch as well. I probably would have saved time. We've already seen two different methods of chipping in this video that I use, and you're about to see a third. I like using a lacquer paint as my first initial base color, and then I'll paint over top of it with an acrylic paint. And the nice thing here, especially that Mr. Silver 8, it's a very durable paint, and you can use a toothpick just to scrape the top layer away. This is great for having controlled small chips. This radiator was pre-painted with a flat black before coming in with the Mr. Metal aluminum, and this is so there's a nice contrast in behind the aftermarket screen that I purchased. One of the biggest characteristics of the Typhoon is that big intake underneath for the radiator, and I decided to make this a focal point by installing an aftermarket mesh screen that had a lot more detail than the kit part. Airfix's is okay, but in 1/24 scale it's really going to stand out, so I decided this was the best option. It's now time to get ready to do some washes on the engine, and the idea here with these washes is to bring out the small details and to highlight some things that aren't completely visible. What I do first is I'll apply a clear coat on top of the engine in 2 thin coats, followed by some Mr. Leveling Thinner to make sure that dries nice and even. Once that's all dry, I'm going to come in with some TAMIYA panel liner just to bring out all those tiny lines in all the nooks and crannies. I'm also going to cheat here a little bit and use the panel liner almost as a wash as well and let it flood in a little bit more than I normally would. This way we get some staining on that engine. Once the panel liner / wash has been drying for a little bit, I'm going to come in with some enamel thinner on Q-tips and brushes and blend it a little bit to add some stained areas. The nice thing about a lacquer clear coat and oil-based paints or enamel-based paints is you can come in afterwards and wipe that away without damaging the paint underneath. Now that all the washes are dried, I'm going to come in with a flat clear coat and tie everything together and get rid of that shine that the engine has. And with that, that concludes our first video in the Big TIFF build series. I hope you've enjoyed it. Click that like button, hit subscribe, ring the bell so you know when new videos are dropping. And in our next video, we're going to cover the fuselage and have this start looking like an aircraft. This is the Model Guy, and I will see you next time.